Aloha, everyone. One of the questions that were raised with Bill was, what are policymakers doing to look at climate change? What's the long-term strategic planning that's happening in the states? So that's what I'm going to speak about. 2 months ago, Hawaii hosted the Olympics of the Environmental World, the World Conservation Congress, part of the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And the reason that Hawaii hosted it, and this is the first time it's ever been held in the US, was because of Hawaii's aloha spirit, its cultural heritage, and its commitment to environmental protection and environmental awareness. Hawaii hosted more than 10,000 people from 192 countries that came here to talk about island Earth. And they adopted the metaphor that Hawaii uses, that Nainoa Thompson helped come up with, to talk about how they're going to act for the next 4 years on their roadmap, as the IUCN called Navigating Island Earth, coming up with commitments to look at integrating indigenous knowledge into sustainability practices around the world. This is something that Hawaii has now given to the globe, this aloha approach to integrating indigenous cultural attitudes into our environmental protection. And at the event, the governor described a vision that he has for his administration to better protect and manage our natural resources. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to talk a little bit, too, about some of our other political leadership. So Senator Schatz is our senior U.S. senator, and at the IUCN, he had the keynote speech, and he talked about how around the U.S. and in other countries, we're starting to see insurance and reinsurance companies and infrastructure investors asking, what are you doing about climate change, before they give you money? And that if you don't have a climate change adaptation plan in place, your rates are going to be higher for your insurance and your reinsurance. So they're already looking at this at the global level for investing billions of dollars into infrastructure in different countries. 2 years ago, he also hosted an event on Oahu where he invited former Vice President Al Gore to come and speak about climate change and how Hawaii has this growing presence in our national conversation about what's happening and what to do about it. Other folks, our other Senator, Mazie Hirono, is on record for supporting climate change, acknowledging that it's real and calling for action. So has Representative Tulsi Gabbard. She's also spoken about this numerous times. And so has Representative Colleen Hanabusa. So all of our congressional leadership are on the record saying we care about climate change, we acknowledge it, and we need to do something about it. And I'm very thankful we're going to have them in Congress given how our election turned out. Here in Hawaii, we also have, at the local and state level, a lot of commitment to looking at climate change. Our mayors have all said that they are aware of climate change and things need to be done to address it. Our state senators, the representative for this district, Representative Nicole Lowen, has been a leader for climate change in the state legislature. So I think we're starting to see this acknowledgement among our political leadership and policymakers that climate change it's not, is it happening, but the question is, what do we do about it? And so when we think about the long-term strategic planning that needs to go in place for what we do about it, responding to climate change has two sides, right? There's the mitigation side and there's the adaptation side. Mitigation is, how do we take carbon out of the air or reduce putting carbon into the air so that we're not raising the temperatures anymore, or as much as we've committed to doing so far. And adaptation is figuring out, how do we live in a world with a changing climate? What are we going to do as our temperatures get higher, as we get more hurricanes? In 2007, the state legislature passed an Act 234, to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So we've already been working on, for 10 years almost, the mitigation side, and that's evolved into the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative and the effort to get us 100% renewable electricity, and we're expanding that conversation already to start looking at what can we do about transportation fuel. So we're fully moving forward on the mitigation side. But what about adaptation? In 2012, there's a Keystone Act by the legislature called Act 286, and it created the Climate Change Adaptation Priority Guidelines, which are these 10 items listed up here. Now, for those of you who don't know about the Hawaii State Planning Act, and I understand perfectly if you don't, but it is the foundational document for the state of Hawaii in all of its planning activities and capital improvement budgets. And every plan, general plan, community plan, land use plan, development plan, has to relate back to the State Planning Act, and it has to address all of the guidelines that are listed in the State Planning Act. So when your county, Hawaii County currently is undergoing its general plan update, correct? So it has to look at these climate change priority guidelines and address them. And if it doesn't, it's up to you as the citizens of the Hawaii County to hold them responsible and say, you haven't done what you are required to do under the State Planning Act. This is a foundational piece of legislation that shapes the entire state and all of the counties and how they have to think about climate change and everything that they're doing. But what does this really mean, right? It's easy to say, hey, here's priority guidelines, now think about them. So 2 years ago, the state legislature created what's called the Interagency Climate, the ICAC, the Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee. And so their task is to actually figure out how to make this stuff work, to bring it down to nuts and bolts level. So what they are doing is they're a committee composed, co-led by Department of Land and Natural Resources and by the State Office of Planning. And their first task is to look at sea level rise. And what they're trying to do is figure out what is the threat of sea level rise and where is it going to impact and what to do about it and what tools do we have to respond to it and what tools do we need to respond to it. They have a report due to the legislature in 2017. Once they have that report in, they'll be moving on to another topic. So it's not just stopping at sea level rise. Next up will probably be something related to water, possibly rainfall, possibly near shore waters, surface water, groundwater. So stepping back, we've heard a lot about climate change. We've heard about hurricanes, changing rainfall, loss of our coral. This is all foundational science that we need to think about this. And one way that we help wrap our minds around this idea of climate change is that we break it up and we break it into its little pieces. And we think about what are we doing already that can help us adapt to climate change. So at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, Governor Ige announced his Sustainable Hawaii Initiative. And as part of that initiative, the idea is that all of these actions are things that help us to enhance our resilience to climate change. Protecting our priority watersheds helps to ensure that we have native forests for our native birds to move to. It helps to ensure that we have rainfall that's falling down and we're capturing it into our aquifers so that as our rainfall declines, we're capturing more of it and able to better withstand drought conditions. The nearshore water management is exactly what Bruce was just talking about. That's how we manage the nearshore water. Doubling local food production. So if we're going to have any sense of self-sufficiency as islands, we need to produce our own food and we need to invest in that. Renewable energy electricity, we've already talked about that. That's been an ongoing effort for the state for a long time. And then our biosecurity plan. One of the greatest threats to our self-sufficiency is invasive species. And we're finally getting Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Department of Land and Natural Resources all together and working on how to help control invasive species. And we have a plan that's been drafted. I believe that Department of Agriculture held some meetings here on, at least on Hawaii Island, getting public feedback from it. So they're working on the draft, trying to move it to a final. These are all important aspects that, while none of them have the words climate change in them, all of them are about climate change adaptation. And so we are able to help start thinking more along those lines. Department of Health also recently hosted a working group with Hawaii Public Health Association, the HPHA, to look at health and climate change. So what about our communities, the people of Hawaii? I mean, we've talked a lot about the biophysical world, but people are vulnerable. Higher temperatures with elderly populations mean additional heat strokes, and minority populations have high health risks already, exacerbated by additional heat strokes and drought conditions. These are all things that our Department of Health is starting to look at. My office is starting to look at how do we integrate climate change into environmental impact statements. The whole point of that process is to look to the future, look at what might happen and how to plan for it to better design projects that we're doing. So what does it mean to say, let's look at climate change? We're trying to figure that out and tease that out. And then, of course, UH has been doing a lot of great research, and not only science research, but also policy research. They're looking at climate refugees. We already have an issue with COFA migrants coming to Hawaii. We are a welcoming place to them because we are so similar to them compared to the mainland. They come to Hawaii, and as their islands come under increasing threat from climate change, we anticipate more people coming to Hawaii. How do we accommodate that? How do we make that a less confrontational situation? How can we plan ahead for these people? So, bringing together this research and policy work, what we're looking at is not climate change, but we're looking at hazards. We're looking at threats. We're looking at things that we already know about, know how to handle. So you can say higher temperatures will result in increased winds and more hurricanes. Well, we already have laws. We have building codes. We have police powers for enforcing actions involving hurricanes and the aftermath of hurricanes. How do we make those work better? And the idea is applying a climate lens. So we look at what we have now, what's existing, and say, if we looked at this from a climate change point of view, does it work? And if it doesn't, why not? And what can we tweak about it to help it, to make it work? And then by doing that, we'll also figure out what do we not have any legislative cover for? No rules, no permits, no approvals. And then figure out what do we need to create that's new to address this new aspect of our world that's being exacerbated by climate change. And I'm sorry, and then one more point, the Honolulu City just passed a charter amendment creating an Office of Climate Change. And the role of that office is to do exactly that. It's to look at what are the other state or county agencies doing and applying this climate lens, saying, we know you guys are busy, you're in the trenches doing your day-to-day work of your agency. Maybe you don't have time to step back and look at the climate change stuff. So this climate office will do that. And then it will also identify the gaps and make recommendations to the mayor and to city council on things that need to be created or fixed. So that's one way that the city and county of Honolulu is looking at this. So, we're still trying to answer the question of what tools do we need. But in the meantime, I can say with a lot of confidence that our policy leaders, our elected leaders and appointed leaders have a consensus that climate change is real, climate change is happening, and we need to figure out what to do about it. And let's start with the tools that we have and then figure out what else do we need.